The divided self in a broken world. How to stay sane in the meaning crisis. We're living through something deeper than just polarization or culture wars. People talk about anxiety, burnout, political chaos, collapsing trust, but underneath all of that is a quieter crisis. A sense that reality itself is fractured, that ourselves are splitting to keep up. Cognitive scientist John Vervaeke calls this the meaning crisis, a tangle of mental health, political, and environmental breakdown, rooted in a loss of shared frameworks for making sense of the world. In this video, I want to look at that crisis as a divided self problem at the societal level, drawing on Jung, Laing, Frankfurt, Ash, Milgram, Festinger, Gabor Mate, Vervaeke and others, and then talk about how to stay sane inside it. From individual madness to social madness in the 1960s, psychiatrist R.D. Laing argued that what we call madness can be a sane response to an insane situation. He described people torn between contradictory demands, told to be authentic while punished for honesty, told they're free while being tightly controlled, and how this double bind fractures the self. Today, that divided self is scaled up. We're told, you are free and informed, while our feeds are tuned by opaque systems designed to manipulate our attention. We're told you are connected, while loneliness and dislocation climb, and Gabor Mate points out that addiction and distress are often normal responses to an unhealthy culture built on stress, inequality, and emotional loss. So the question isn't just what's wrong with individuals, it's what happens to the self when the shared world stops making coherent sense. Fragmenting tech and the death of a shared world. Vervaeke argues that the meaning crisis is tied to the collapse of a shared mythos, the deep stories and practices that used to orient our lives. Into that vacuum steps a global attention economy that thrives on fragmentation, infinite scroll, micro-targeted outrage, algorithmic tribes. Researchers describe attention fragmentation as constant, involuntary disruption of focus by notifications, app switching, and compulsive multitasking, which erodes concentration, memory, and meaningful thought. Under that kind of bombardment, your experience of reality becomes a jump cut of disconnected shards stitched together by platforms that optimize for engagement, not truth. That makes you vulnerable to what philosopher Harry Frankfurt calls bullshit, communication that's indifferent to truth, aimed instead at impression management and control. The bullshitter, Frankfurt says, isn't primarily lying, they're faking, treating truth as irrelevant and training us to do the same. A culture soaked in bullshit produces people who feel both informed and deeply unsure that anything is real. The social machinery of the divided self. The divided self isn't only an inner drama, it's produced by social machinery we know disturbingly well. Conformity. Solomon Asch showed that when a group unanimously gives obviously wrong answers, about 37% of people will go along on a given trial, and 75% conform at least once, even when the truth is visually obvious. That tells us something brutal. Under social pressure, many of us will deny our own perception to avoid exclusion. Obedience. Stanley Milgram found that about 65% of participants would administer apparently lethal electric shocks to a stranger when instructed by an authority figure in a lab coat. Every participant went to at least a clearly dangerous level before hesitating. In other words, ordinary people will override conscience when authority and institutional framing demand it. Cognitive dissonance. Leon Festinger showed how we resolve inner contradictions by changing our beliefs to justify our behavior. In one famous study, people paid $1 to lie about a boring task, later insisted it was actually enjoyable, because they needed to see themselves as honest and reasonable. When our actions and values clash, we often rewrite reality to preserve a coherent self-image. Layer these together in a digital, politicized environment, and you get a population pulled between perception, conscience, and survival. Online tribes, institutional narratives, and personal experience often diverge, and we cope by splitting. One self for public performance, another for private doubt. Jung, complexes, and the cultural shadow. Carl Jung argued that the psyche is not a single, unified ego, but a landscape of complexes, semi-autonomous parts formed around powerful experiences and traumas. Modern culture, as Jung's interpreters note, often privileges a narrow, rational, patriarchal ego, while repressing intuitive, emotional, and relational modes of being. Those split-off parts don't disappear, they return as symptoms, projections, and collective shadow, hysteria, scapegoating, extremist, fantasies. When an entire culture represses uncertainty, vulnerability, and grief, it gets haunted by them through conspiracy movements, dehumanization, or apocalyptic and utopian fantasies. Vervaeke describes zombies as a symbol of this: mindless, hungry, de-worlded selves that keep moving after meaning has died. Laing saw psychosis as a kind of fragmented survival strategy. Jung saw neurosis as the price of refusing inner wholeness. Mate sees addiction as an attempted solution to unbearable pain. All of them, in different ways, are describing a self that splits to stay functional in an environment that has become incoherent. So, how do we stay sane? 3 anchors. I want to offer 3 anchors, not fixes, but practices to resist becoming a divided puppet of a fragmented world. Anchor 1. Truth orientation over tribal loyalty. Frankfurt's point about bullshit is that the real danger isn't lies, it's indifference to truth. Staying sane means cultivating a stubborn, almost spiritual commitment to reality, being willing to update your views, to say I don't know, to hold complexity even when your group wants slogans. Vervaeke frames this as recovering wisdom and relevance realization, training your attention to track what is actually real and important rather than what is merely viral. Concrete moves. Regularly seek out thoughtful disagreement, not outrage, but articulate perspectives that challenge your own. Practice steel manning, stating the strongest version of a view you dislike before criticizing it. When you feel the rush of certainty online, pause and ask, how do I know this? What would change my mind? Anchor 2. Restitching the inner and outer stories. Festinger's work on cognitive dissonance shows how we bend truth to avoid inner discomfort. Jung's work shows that what we refuse to integrate becomes shadow. Staying sane means letting contradictions come into awareness instead of forcing premature coherence. Concrete moves. Journaling or voice noting. Part of me believes X, part of me believes Y, and they don't fit. You're making dissonance explicit, which already reduces its unconscious power. Track where your public opinions and private intuitions diverge. That gap is where the divided self lives. When you catch yourself rationalizing something that feels off, name it as dissonance rather than truth. Anchor 3. Humanizing connection in an inhumane system. Ash and Milgram show how isolation with a group or authority can override conscience. Mate reminds us that trauma and addiction flourish where authentic connection is missing. Vervaeke and many others argue that meaning is deeply relational, found in communities of practice, not just in ideas. Concrete moves. Invest in small, recurring circles where you can think out loud without performance. A reading group, a faith or practice community, or just 3 friends who meet weekly to talk honestly. Make at least one relationship in your life a bullshit-reduced zone, somebody who is allowed to call you on self-deception, and whom you will not cancel for doing so. Engage in embodied practices with others, movement, ritual, shared work, because meaning is not just what you think, it's how you live and relate. We are not just individuals having private breakdowns, we are selves being reshaped by a culture in which attention is mined, truth is optional, and old sources of meaning have crumbled. Laing, Jung, Mate, Vervaeke, Frankfurt, Ash, Milgram, Festinger, and many others give us a disturbing map of how the self cracks under those pressures, and also hint at a path forward, toward honesty, integration, and courageous relationship. Staying sane in a fragmented world is not about finding a perfect ideology. It's about refusing to become a stranger to your own perception, your own conscience, and your own capacity for love.